Welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host this morning, and I'm so glad that you could join us for another segment. We're going to have a conversation this morning with Michelle Dickinson. Now, she's an author, TED speaker, and an advocate, and she's joining us on the program to talk about ways to decrease the mental health stigma and shame that prevents people from getting the care that they need. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Michelle Dickinson. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Neil.
Now, are you a psychologist, a psychiatrist? What exactly is your background?
I am neither. I am just a human being with lived experience around mental health in three different ways. So the first way is that I grew up with my mother who had bipolar and I was her caregiver. The second way is that I struggled with depression myself in my 40s because of a life event. And then the third is that I helped build a employee resource group within a large Fortune 500 company for specifically those suffering with mental illness.
Now, you say you grew up taking care of your mom who was diagnosed with bipolar. Talk about some of the challenges. I mean, were you a teenager? Did it continue throughout your early adulthood years?
Yeah, my mom started to demonstrate signs probably when I was very, very little, about 4 years old. She struggled throughout my entire life after that. So she started to act, have the rapid cycling of extreme mania to depression. And then, just as I was growing up as an adolescent, having to care for her so that she, when she was too fragile, she wasn't alone by herself until she ultimately would get so bad that she would then need to be hospitalized and treated. So, yeah, it was a bit of a roller coaster, as I like to refer to it, because you just never knew the mom that you were going to get when you walked in the door.
Was there a fear on your part or a concern that you too would suffer as she did?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, actually, I was adopted, so I always thought, oh, look, I'm immune to this. Thank goodness I don't have her same genetic pool. But it's so funny because nature versus nurture, right? I seemed to be fine, although obviously I suffered from the impact of her mental, physical, and emotional abuse. And then in my 40s, I dealt with a major life event. And that just reminded me, listen, nobody's immune to mental illness, no matter what. You could have no family history and life can smack you upside the head and you're going to be having to navigate that. So, yep.
We hear bipolar quite a bit when we're talking about healthcare. When in the media, bipolar seems to be knocked around as much as the common cold. It is much more serious, I do believe, than we seem to give it credence in the media.
Yeah, and I think as someone who loved someone with mental illness, and specifically bipolar, that's a bit frustrating, right? Because we have people who use that word too casually when that's really a serious diagnosis. I mean, to witness someone cycling and witness someone's depression so severe, and then that mania that you're like, hold on to your hats because you don't know what that person's going to do. It's really, it really diminishes the suffering that goes on with someone with bipolar.
How many people would you say, if you know a roundabout number, are dealing with bipolar that know about it?
See, that know about it or that admit it or that seek help. I think that there's probably far more people who don't understand what's going on, but it's become normal for them to navigate it. That they don't seek help. So it's virtually impossible to know that, right? Because unless you are comfortable with mental illness or comfortable with talking about what you're dealing with, you won't know, you won't seek help, and you won't get the treatment or the diagnosis.
What is it about mental illness? I mean, the stigma obviously is there, but do you think the stigma is the same for most people, or are there different aspects of stigma?
I think mental illness is something that has come a long way. So, back in the 70s and 80s when my mother was suffering, I think it was far more stigmatized. You do not dare talk about it. Mm-hmm. But nowadays we have these amazing celebrities leading by example, opening their mouths, sharing, hey, listen, I have anxiety. It took me out of the game. Right. So those are great examples that we can, lean into and talk to and understand from, that ultimately do reduce the stigma. But the reality is people aren't comfortable with it yet. And so if they're not comfortable with it, they're not going to get the help. It's shame too. It's also riddled with shame. Would you want to talk to your boss about mental illness? No, it's shame. And then it's fear. Are you going to hold me in a lesser light than you would my peer? People are so afraid. And then they're also afraid of treatment. Well, what is that treatment going to look like for me? And am I going to benefit from it, or is it going to numb me? Because in my mom's case, she didn't want to take her medication because it would numb her from having feelings in general. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of factors that play into stigma internally and externally.
You know, it's particularly in the workplace. I mean, there are so many different workplaces. You've got the office, you've got firefighters, policemen, you've got healthcare workers, all kinds of work environments. With bipolar being, as we said, so common a term, how do we in the workplace reduce that stigma and let people know that, hey, you know, just because you're suffering or dealing with something, that's no reason to fear your career?
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of great things we can do in our workplaces around that. You know, when you look at diversity and inclusion and the inclusion of people with physical disabilities, that should be equally met for people with invisible disabilities. So what does that mean? That means companies start to openly engage and talk about mental health and well-being with their employees and create structures that support employees wherever they are in terms of their own mental illnesses. They should be accommodated like you would accommodate someone in a wheelchair. There's a lot of things companies can do. They can look at their policies and see how their policies support an employee who maybe suffers from a mental illness. Because listen, you know, people can't put their game face on every day and go to work and pretend. I mean, they can, but why would you want that for your employee? Why not create a culture where it's okay to talk about mental health and then additional support mechanisms behind that 800 number you call if you really need help? Like, why not create a community in your company? Why not have, you know, courageous employees who've navigated it successfully start to talk about it, or a leader who dealt with it talk about it? Cultivating a culture of acceptance, compassion is so important and can be done almost in any workplace.
In wrapping up, let's briefly talk about convincing or letting people know that they deserve the care, they deserve respect, and they deserve consideration. Maybe the mental health condition makes you believe that you're not worthy to be cared for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, and I think a lot of people, like I said before, they don't realize that their joy is being diminished and they think they got to navigate it on their own. And I think, you know, people need to recognize that the brain is just another organ. And when we start to relate to the brain as just another organ in the body, you start to think about it. Well, if I hurt my hip, I would go to the doctor and I'd get the support I need and I'd move on. You know, we have this thing where we're like, okay, we have to figure this out on our own. And when we stay inside of our heads and try to figure it out, it's so hard. It becomes far less scary when we open our mouth and talk to someone we trust about how we're feeling. And that becomes an access to go and to get the help that you deserve.
Particularly in teens, I would say that is of the utmost importance. I mean, there's a lot of teen suicide based on depression and other factors, but getting teens talking about what they're going through is of utmost importance.
Yeah, and that all starts with connectedness, right? The human need fundamentally is that we stay connected, and yet in a world of social media and technology, we are far less connected. So when we're trying to talk about how do I address this with my children? How do I make sure that they're okay? It's all about that connectedness. It's about, are you engaging face to face? Are you looking into each other's eyes? Are you checking in with one another? Are you asking them how they're feeling? And is that a normal conversation, or is that a conversation you're having once a month that makes it even more awkward? Mm-hmm. But it's really staying connected to one another and understanding what people are dealing with that can help normalize a conversation when someone doesn't feel quite right and then they're comfortable verbalizing it.
Michelle, where can we learn more online about mental illness as it relates to overall health?
Sure. You can absolutely check out my website. I have a lot of great tools and tips for people who want to be change agents in their companies. And that's michelledickinson.com. I have a lot of great information. I have guest bloggers who share information about their experiences navigating mental illness. Feel free to reach out to me.
Great. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us here on Health Professional Radio this morning.
Thanks for having me, Neil.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Michelle Dickinson. And we've been talking about mental health as it relates to overall health. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Listen in, download it, SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.